It seemed like a normal Saturday morning when Chris got a call from two people claiming to be from the HOA, accusing him of noise violations. But Chris knew he hadn't played any music. As they threatened fines, something felt off. They weren't even real HOA agents. What happened next will shock even the most experienced. But let's start from the beginning. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind that Chris, a seasoned attorney with a sharp mind, treasured. The air was still, and he was settling in to enjoy his weekend, his mind finally at ease after a grueling week of work. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was an unknown number, but that wasn't unusual. Chris answered, thinking it was just another telemarketer or maybe a colleague. But the voice on the other end wasn't either. "Mr. Thompson?" a woman's voice said. "This is Susan from the Homeowners Association enforcement team. We've received reports of loud music coming from your house. You're in violation of the noise ordinance. We'll have to fine you unless you resolve this immediately." Chris frowned, his brow furrowing. He was sure he hadn't been playing any music. The only sounds coming from his house were the usual background noise, the kids playing in the yard, the faint hum of the refrigerator. But loud music? That didn't add up. "Excuse me?" he asked, trying to stay calm, his voice steady. "I haven't heard any music. There's no way I violated any noise ordinance." The woman, Susan, didn't hesitate. Her tone was firm, insistent. "We're giving you one chance to comply, or you'll be fined. You have no choice but to pay the fine or face further action." Chris's confusion quickly turned to suspicion. There was something off about this whole situation. Susan and her colleague Tom had no official credentials. They didn't mention any real HOA association or any formal procedures. The more he listened, the clearer it became. These weren't real HOA officers. They were just two people trying to pull a scam, pretending to wield authority they didn't have. Chris's lawyer instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. But he stayed silent for a moment, calculating his next move carefully. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chris's suspicion grew as he started digging into the backgrounds of Susan and Tom. He quickly uncovered something that made his blood run cold. These two weren't part of the official Homeowners Association, HOA leadership at all. In fact, they weren't even remotely affiliated with any legitimate HOA authority. They were self-appointed neighborhood enforcers, taking it upon themselves to act like they had the power to fine and control others. Their entire facade was built on smoke and mirrors, a play for power that was as fake as it was dangerous. Chris's search revealed that Susan and Tom had been operating like this for weeks, preying on unsuspecting neighbors. They had found a way to intimidate people into paying fines for trivial infractions, things that hardly qualified as violations. And their approach was aggressive. Harassment, intimidation, and manipulation were their go-to tactics. They seemed to target the most vulnerable, knowing they could get away with it if they pushed hard enough. The more Chris uncovered, the angrier he became. This wasn't just some isolated incident. Susan had even tried to charge his best friend Alex for something as ridiculous as an issue with his mailbox, an issue so minor that it was laughable. But Susan, with her fabricated authority, was determined to make it seem like a serious offense. Alex, a proud but intimidated man, had nearly paid the fine out of sheer confusion and fear of the so-called enforcers. But it wasn't just the absurdity of the fines that disturbed Chris. What struck him most was the sheer disrespect Susan and Tom had for any legitimate authority. They weren't just lawbreakers, they were bullies, plain and simple. They were abusing the trust of the community, manipulating their neighbors into submission with no real power or right to do so. And Chris wasn't about to let them get away with it. The anger burning in him was a fire he couldn't ignore. These self-appointed enforcers were going to find out that they had picked the wrong person to mess with. Chris had reached his breaking point. He wasn't just another disgruntled resident. He was the mayor's right-hand man, someone with influence in the very heart of the city. The moment he realized Susan and Tom were crossing the line, he understood they were out of their depth. They had no idea who they were messing with. He wasn't going to let them continue terrorizing his neighbors. With a sharp focus, Chris reached out to his network of trusted contacts. He wasn't just gathering information. He was building a case. What he discovered sent a wave of righteous anger through him. Susan and Tom had been running a scam, pretending to be HOA enforcers to extort money from unsuspecting residents. This wasn't just a petty scheme, it was a pattern. Several of his neighbors had already filed complaints about them, each one with the same story: intimidation, baseless fines, and the threat of legal action. They had been playing people for fools, and Chris wasn't about to let that slide. He knew time was of the essence. If he didn't step in now, they'd keep bullying more residents. He wasn't going to let these two self-appointed enforcers have free rein over his community. With the mayor's trust and his own connections, Chris knew exactly what to do. He made a discreet call to the real HOA board, explaining the situation without drawing too much attention. But the key move came when he had a quiet word with the mayor. Together, they carefully laid the groundwork for what was coming next. Chris worked fast, ensuring the pieces were in place before Susan and Tom could do any more damage. The plan was simple but effective. Expose them for the frauds they were, strip them of any perceived power, and ensure they were legally removed from the community's affairs. Chris had no interest in public spectacle. He wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for justice. With his strategic mind and the weight of the mayor's office behind him, Chris knew Susan and Tom had no idea what was about to hit them. It was only a matter of time before their house of cards came crashing down. The day had arrived, and Susan and Tom had no idea what was waiting for them. They thought it was just another routine visit to Chris's house, another fine, another warning. But as they pulled into the driveway, they were met not only by Chris, but by a crowd of his neighbors. Each of them was holding evidence, papers, photos, and complaints. Chris stood at the front, his demeanor cold, his eyes unwavering. Susan and Tom didn't notice the shift at first. They approached, carrying their usual air of authority, ready to drop off yet another unjust fine. But as Chris stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense silence, everything changed. "You've been playing a dangerous game," Chris said, his words firm and unyielding. "But you're not real HOA officers. You've been scamming everyone." His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In that moment, the truth was clear, and there was no denying it. Chris handed them a thick stack of documents, proof of their fraud. False fines, forged enforcement, and multiple complaints from residents flooded the air. The once confident Susan and Tom looked like they'd been hit with a hammer. Their smugness crumbled, replaced by confusion and panic. They tried to stammer out excuses, but there was no way out. The evidence was irrefutable. They had no power, no authority, and no legitimacy. The facade they'd worked so hard to build had collapsed in front of their eyes. The neighbors, now emboldened by Chris's leadership, stood behind him, their faith in him stronger than ever. With a swift move, Chris had ensured that Susan and Tom were removed from any position of power. Their so-called fines were nullified, their hold over the community shattered. The neighbors, who had once feared these fake enforcers, now rallied around Chris, grateful for his quiet strength and determination. Chris hadn't just won for himself, he'd won for the entire neighborhood. With calm resolve and a strategic mind, he had exposed the frauds who had been preying on his community. In the end, it was his level-headed leadership that had stopped them.